My name is Jasmine Chavez, and today I'm here to talk to you about why drugs should be legal. Now, that does not mean I think people should be able to buy incredibly dangerous drugs with ease. The point I try to argue today is why hallucinogenic or any helpful drugs should be legalized and decriminalized. What kind of drugs am I talking about? Well, hallucinogenic drugs alter the thinking process and perception of a person in a way that leads to crazy distortions of reality. What this means is, well, you hallucinate. The main hallucinogenic drugs people are familiar with are lysergic acid, aka LSD and acid, psilocybin, aka magic mushrooms slash shrooms, mescaline, aka peyote, DMT, ketamine, aka Special K, and phencyclide, aka angel dust slash rocket fuel slash PCP. Now, many argue that PCP shouldn't be included in this list or associated with LSD class as, quote, they show no evidence of cross tolerance with them, end quote. This means that if you take LSD one day and take another hallucinogenic drug the following day, the efficacy of the other hallucinogen will either decrease significantly or altogether, so you won't feel the effects. When people think of hallucinating on drugs, everyone thinks to how it's portrayed on television, because many people wouldn't know if it's accurate or not. I interviewed a great friend of mine I won't name that has an LSD and can dispute how LSD effects are shown on television. Me, you're a student at UCSD. Do you know a lot of students that have done illegal drugs? Friend, I would say that I know a fair amount of students who have done illegal drugs, including MDMA, mushrooms, and acid, but I don't know any who have done any highly addictive illegal drugs such as heroin or methamphetamines. Me, how many times have you done LSD? Friend, I have done LSD exactly once. Me, can you tell me how you felt and for how long? Friend, I think the main two things I felt while on LSD were introspective and happy. When I took it, it was daytime, and I was at a small river, and I remember feeling more appreciative of the nature around me. When it was nighttime, I laid down and had the introspection to realize parts of myself I was previously unaware of and wanted to change, and I have been slowly working towards making those changes for a healthier outlook. Also, I took half of a tab at a time, one half at about 2 p.m. and the other half at about 6, so I remember feeling the effects of the drug for about 6 to 8 hours, but not in an intense or uncomfortable way. Me. You've seen how LSD or hallucinogenic drugs in general are portrayed on television. Is it accurate? Did you see anything move, change colors, speak, etc.? Friend, from my experience, I don't think TV or media portray LSD in a way that is in line with the effect it had on me. I did not personally see strong visuals or have a break from reality, which I feel like most depictions in media exaggerate. The visual hallucinations I had were very mild, stars looking like they were moving, for example, and the introspective aspect of the drug was stronger for me. I think back to the portrayal of LSD in the show You, where a character hallucinates killing someone and being covered in blood, and while I can't speak to everyone's experience with the drug after using it, I personally feel like those type of depictions are very inaccurate, and while they serve to advance the plot of the story, they do so at the expense of the public's perception of the drug, like these, and perpetuate misinformation to make them appear scarier than they are. That was the end of my interview, and there you have it. The portrayal of these drugs on TV are very inaccurate. Because there is lots of evidence and studies on LSD, I will be focusing on the effects that it has on our brain and body. According to a paper by Barry L. Jacobs, hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD, quote, act in the brain at a specific receptor subtype for the chemical neurotransmitter serotonin, end quote. What this means is when we take these hallucinogenic drugs, they affect receptors in our brain that increase serotonin levels significantly higher than without the drugs. In short, it makes you happy. LSD affects many of the, quote, functions that characterize the human mind, including affect, cognition, volition, interoception, and perception, end quote. This is important because it emphasizes exactly what you'll experience on LSD as it affects the way you speak, your will, and how you see things. So now that everyone knows the basics of how it affects you, why should it be legal? Why was it even made illegal in the first place? You will be shocked as to why. Some people know that the CIA has many connections to LSD, but many don't know what specifically. I'm going to read out an excerpt from the book Acid Rain: The Complete Social History of LSD, the CIA, the 60s, and Acid Dreams by Martin A. Lee and Bruce Schlein. Quote, the drug that connected so many of us to the organic mystery of a vastly alive universe turns out to have been, at least in the beginning, a secret CIA project to find a truth serum. It's frightening to think that the CIA spooks have used LSD with electroshock and torture to get information out of prisoners. End quote. The project was called MK Ultra, and it left hundreds of American and Canadian citizens with lifelong damage. Absolutely despicable things done by our government. Here is a video of some victims giving testimonies on what they went through under the hands of the Montreal Allen Memorial Institute through the CIA.
Cameron had this renowned reputation of being the most incredible, godlike physician, and nobody questioned him.
Last winter, City News brought you Marlene Levinson's story. Her aunt was a victim of Dr. Ewan Cameron's brainwashing experiments at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute in the 40s. Marlene says since she and others have shared their stories, some 50 survivors and their family members have come forward with stories of their own.
The dots started to connect almost instantly after our interview in December. We have people from British Columbia, from just about every province.
Dr. Cameron developed a treatment he called depatterning in hopes of curing schizophrenia. It involved massive doses of electroshock treatments, sleep-induced comas, LSD, and barbiturates. His goal was to wipe his patients' minds and then reprogram them. In the 1950s, the CIA started funding his work as part of MK Ultra, a Cold War-era program developed to learn about mind control. The Canadian government also provided funding in the 50s and 60s. No one consented to being experimented on.
They gave them to me, but I had no action as to what they did to me or what. But when I woke up, I was free.
Nancy Layton's story is similar to Marlene's aunt. She wrote this note to her daughter a long time ago.
They destroyed many parts of me, but I'm lucky to be alive and happy to tell you the truth.
In 1961, when she was 18, her parents brought her to the Allen Memorial Institute because of what her daughter calls a breakdown. Her mother pulled her out after 6 months.
She said, "We're not having any more of this fuddle stuff. Put on your clothes and get ready and come home."
Her medical records show doctors reassuring her father that the treatment will not induce any permanent injury to her brain or personality, but they did. She was unable to raise her daughter.
I grew up not really knowing my mom, not having a mom around. I was lucky and fortunate enough that my grandparents on my father's side took me in at a very, very young age.
Julie's father's story is a little different. In 1957, Charles Tanney was admitted to the Allen at the age of 43 because of a neurological pain in his face.
If you go in for toe fungus, you don't need a sledgehammer in your head. You know, that's about how appropriate it was, what they did to him.
His medical records read he has incontinence and a good deal of confusion, but he's not yet in the third stage of depatterning since he's able to seek to reorient himself by asking where his wife is. When he came home after 3 months, he didn't remember who he was, and 4-year-old Julie lost the father she remembered.
He talked about me being the apple of his eye. It wasn't the way things were when he came home. It was very different. It was almost like he was detached.
Her father had a massive stroke when he was 60 and wasn't able to communicate until the day he died 20 years later.
I never expected that my difficult childhood was because of this. And such a horrible story. I never would have imagined it in a million years. You know, so did it affect me? Greatly. Did it affect my brother and sister? Greatly.
Both Julie and Angela didn't find out about what happened to their parents until they were young adults, but now they know they're not alone.
I had goosebumps because I'm like, okay, it's I finally don't feel alone in this.
Tomorrow, we'll tell you what the group's doing to get justice for their family members.
The idea of letting my father's life, which obviously wasn't a great one, go past unrecognized is very difficult.
In Montreal, Tina Teneriello, City News.
The remarkable thing, however, is all the research that came from these hallucinogenic drugs, specifically microdosing or taking small amounts at a time. Here is a video by Vox that highlights how hallucinogenic drugs really help anxiety, depression, even addiction.
Research on psychedelics for medical use is preliminary. Most studies suffer from really small sample sizes, and that's partly because the federal government lists LSD and psilocybin as Schedule I drugs. So researchers face extra red tape, and funding is really hard to come by. Vox writer Germán Lopez reviewed dozens of studies that have been done, and he found that psychedelics show promise for treating addiction, OCD, anxiety, and in some cases, depression. One small study of 15 smokers found that 80% were able to abstain from smoking for 6 months after a psilocybin treatment. In a pilot study of 12 advanced cancer patients suffering from end-of-life anxiety, participants who took psilocybin generally showed lower scores on a test of depression. And a smaller study suggested that psilocybin treatment could actually help people with alcohol dependence cut back on their drinking days. We don't have all the answers as to what exactly these treatments are doing in the brain, but they seem to work by providing a meaningful and even mystical experience that leads to lasting changes in a patient's life.
The issues that I talked about or thought about or went into during my experience were transformative in the sense that I got to look at them through a different lens.
I know this sounds weird. I feel like I have more connections in my brain that I couldn't access before.
That feeling that Alana is describing is actually pretty spot on. When you take LSD, your brain looks something like this. You can actually see a higher degree of connectivity between various parts of the brain. It's not limited to the visual cortex. This communication inside the brain helps explain visual hallucinations, and the researchers argue that it could also explain why psychedelics can help people overcome serious mental issues. They wrote that you can think of psychiatric disorders as the brain being entrenched in pathology. Harmful patterns become automated and hard to change, and that's what can make things like anxiety and addiction and depression very hard to treat.
The reason that those kinds of conditions are so difficult to treat is that there's something more to them than just the illness.
That's Albert Garcia Romu. He's a Johns Hopkins researcher who's worked on studies of psilocybin and smoking addiction, like the one that Alana's involved with. He says that when participants take psychedelics,
they have very profound, meaningful experiences that can sometimes help them to make new insights into their own behaviors, and also to kind of reconnect with their values and priorities in terms of what's very important to them.
If these drugs are so harmful and dangerous as the government says, why would they give them to some of our most vulnerable citizens? Of course, I mean cancer patients. Now that I have answered why they should be legal, why are they even illegal in the first place? Richard Nixon started the war on drugs and claimed it was, quote, public enemy number one, end quote. He granted the DEA funding and sweeping authority to enforce the outlaw of many drugs, such as cannabis and LSD. The outrageous part to me is that it was put in Schedule I, which explicitly is for substances with no known medical uses, when in fact LSD has been shown to help with severe addiction as previously stated, along with migraines and cluster headaches, and has other psychiatric uses. The craziest part to me is that LSD is one of the most studied drugs ever because of Project MKUltra. It was outlawed in the 60s. According to an article calling to end the war on drugs by Betsy Pearl, since 1971, quote, the war on drugs has cost the United States an estimated $1 trillion. In 2015, the federal government spent an estimated $9.2 million every day to incarcerate people charged with drug-related offenses. That's more than $3.3 billion annually, end quote. Another source I'd like to cite is on the Human Rights Watch website. Quote, our research shows that blacks comprise 62.7% and whites 36.7% of all drug offenders admitted to state prison, even though federal surveys and other data detailed in this report show clearly that this racial disparity bears scant relation to racial differences in drug offending. There are, for example, 5 times more white drug users than black. Relative to population, black men are admitted to state prison on drug charges at a rate that is 13.4 times greater than that of white men. In large part because of the extraordinary racial disparities in incarceration for drug offenses, blacks are incarcerated for all offenses at 8.2 times the rate of whites. 1 in every 20 black men over the age of 18 in the United States is in federal or state prison, compared to 1 in 180 white men. End quote. We are paying thousands in taxes to send young black people to federal prison when there are thousands of cases of pedophiles serving no jail time. I could list so many examples, but we see them every day in the news. Pretty white teachers molesting and raping their students and getting a slap on the wrist in court when a young black man gets a life sentence for selling a gram of weed, or they just get murdered. This is why we need to say their names and call for their justice. Hashtag Black Lives Matter.